"Witch, get away from here!" the merchant screamed, stumbling back from his own stall, as if Ragnar's shadow could burn him where he stood. "I will sell you nothing. You've buried half this village already, and still you dare show your face at my counter. Someone ought to drag you to the stake and be done with it." The market noise dimmed around them, a dozen conversations dying at once, eyes turning cold and hungry for a scene. Baskets were pulled closer to chests. A mother yanked her child back by the collar. Ragnar said nothing. She had heard these words too many times to waste breath arguing with them. Too many market days ending the same way no matter what she carried to trade or how quietly she asked. She lowered her head, let her empty basket hang against her hip, and turned back through the crowd, past spitting glances and whispered curses that followed her all the way to the tree line. Hours later, when the square had settled back into its ordinary noise, a covered wagon creaked in from the eastern road, wheels groaning under uneven weight. Kael sat hunched over the reins, gaunt with exhaustion, and behind him, wrapped in blankets that smelled of sickness, his son Leo breathed in short, rattling gasps that caught in his throat. Kael climbed down stiffly and began asking anyone who would meet his eyes whether a healer lived nearby, his voice fraying at the edges. One farmer, glancing over his shoulder, as though the words themselves were dangerous, murmured something about a hut near the forest's edge. Before Kael could thank him properly, a passerby cut in sharply, grabbing his sleeve. "Don't listen to that fool," he hissed. "She's a witch. She cursed half this village into the ground. Nothing comes from her hands but death, stranger. Turn that wagon around while you still can." Kael had no better option, and a father with a dying son does not haggle long with strangers' warnings. He turned the wagon away from the village square, down a narrow track, swallowed by overgrown branches, the wheels catching on roots as the afternoon light thinned above him into gray. Leo's breathing rattled behind him with every jolt of the wagon, and twice Kael had to stop and press a hand to the boy's burning forehead just to steady his own nerve before driving on. The path finally opened onto a small clearing, and there stood a modest hut, its timber walls weathered but sound, smoke curling steady and thin from a stone chimney. A tall figure stepped into the doorway before he could even set the brake. Ragnar's eyes were a deep, unblinking gold, her frame broad and towering in a way that made every old instinct in Kael's blood scream to turn the wagon around and run. He did not. He climbed down on unsteady legs, hands raised in front of him, voice cracking apart at the edges. "Please," he said. "My son is dying. Someone in the village told me you could help him. I have nowhere else to go. I swear it. I have nothing left to lose by asking." Ragnar did not answer his fear with words at all. She stepped past him toward the wagon without hesitation, pulled back the damp blanket, pressed 2 fingers to Leo's throat, and her expression hardened into something sharp and purposeful. "Bring him inside," she said. "Now. There is no time left to stand here and talk about what frightens you." Kael obeyed without thinking twice, lifting his son's limp body against his chest, stumbling after the orc into the dim warmth of her home, the door shutting behind them against the darkening forest. Inside, the air hung thick with the smell of dried herbs, wood smoke, and something bitter simmering low over the fire. Ragnar laid Leo down on a narrow cot and worked with quick, practiced hands, pressing her palm flat against his forehead, tilting his chin to listen to his labored breath, murmuring under her breath as she catalogued each symptom in a language Kael didn't recognize. "Swamp fever," she said finally, not looking up, "deep in his chest. It has been building for days, maybe longer than you noticed." She crushed a paste of dark leaves between a mortar and pestle, worked it into the boy's chest with firm, careful strokes, then set a pot of roots and pale bark to boil, the steam filling the small room with a sharp, earthy scent that made Kael's eyes water. He hovered nearby, every muscle tensed, ready to intervene at the smallest wrong movement. Distrust still coiled tight behind his eyes, despite everything he had already agreed to. But as the hours dragged past, he found himself watching her hands move with a gentleness that unsettled his expectations more than any spell or curse could have managed. She never rushed, never grew rough, even when Leo thrashed weakly against the fever gripping him, murmuring names that weren't hers. Twice the boy's fever spiked again, and both times Ragna reached for a different jar without hesitation, adjusting the dose as though she had done this before for other frightened fathers. Through the long night, she sat beside the cot without complaint, changing damp cloths on the boy's forehead, feeding him spoonfuls of bitter broth between his cracked lips, until near dawn, his breathing slowed at last into something steady and unmistakably human again, and Kael let his own head fall forward against the wall in exhausted relief. Morning light crept pale through the shutters, and Leo's fever had finally broken, his small chest rising and falling in an even, unhurried rhythm as he slept for the first time in days. Ragna wiped her hands on a stained cloth and turned to Kael, her voice flat with exhaustion but certain. "He survived the worst of it," she said, "but he is far too weak to travel. 2 weeks, at least, before the road won't undo what I just spent the night saving." Kael sank onto a bench near the fire, relief loosening something tight in his shoulders for the first time since the bandits had struck, and thanked her with a sincerity that seemed to surprise even himself. Then his face darkened with a different, heavier weight, and he rubbed a hand across his jaw before speaking. "I have nothing to pay you with," he admitted, the words costing him visibly. "Bandits took my coin and half my goods on the road 3 days back, before I ever reached your village. I have only my hands and my back left to offer anyone." He straightened on the bench, meeting her eyes directly instead of looking away. "Let me work for you then. Whatever needs doing around this place, I'll do it, for as long as it takes, until the debt is paid in full." Ragna studied him a long moment, arms crossed, as if weighing whether to trust a man who had trembled visibly at her doorstep only hours before, and whose son now slept safely under her own roof. Something in his stubborn honesty seemed to settle the question for her. Finally, she gave a short, decisive nod. "Fine," she said. "There's wood to split before the week is out, and the roof wants mending before the rains come. We'll call that a start, and see how you manage it before I decide anything more." That evening, Kael stood outside the hut, splitting logs under the last gray light, the rhythmic crack of the axe, the only sound beside the wind moving through the branches overhead. When Ragna came out to gather the split wood into her arms, he set the axe down against the stump and finally asked what had been nagging at him since the market that morning. "Why does the whole village hate you like that?" he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "I've seen what your hands actually do. That's not a curse, whatever they're calling it back there." Ragna's jaw tightened, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, stacking wood into her arms with more force than necessary. Then she spoke, low and carefully controlled, each word measured. "Months ago, people started dying in that village. Sudden deaths, wrong deaths, the kind that don't follow any illness I know how to name. I tried to help. I healed who I could reach in time, and still they kept dying." Her eyes hardened further, gold catching the last of the light, and somehow, all at once, the headman Aldous, the mine owner Vane, and the miller Thorn began telling the exact same story to anyone who would listen. That a witch's curse was killing their people, and only banishing me would end it. Kael frowned, turning the 3 names over slowly in his mind, a merchant's old instinct for patterns stirring uneasily beneath his ribs. 3 of the most powerful men in that village, all pointing the same accusing finger at the same time, all somehow untouched themselves by whatever was truly killing everyone else. "That's not superstition spreading on its own," he said quietly, almost to himself. "That sounds like a story someone built on purpose, and built carefully." The next day, Kael walked back into the village to trade what little remained of his goods for flour at Thorn's mill, the wooden building groaning and shuddering under the slow turn of its great wheel. The miller met him at the counter with open contempt, weighing the sack with deliberate, insulting slowness, his eyes flicking more than once toward the forest road behind Kael's shoulder. "Careful your green-skinned beast doesn't boil your pup for supper one of these nights," Thorn said, shoving the flour sack across the counter with a sneer that showed his crooked teeth. Kael's jaw clenched hard enough to ache, but he kept his merchant's face steady, the same practiced mask he had worn through 100 bad deals and worse insults, and said nothing in return that might cost him the flour. He hefted the sack onto his shoulder, felt its unusual weight settle wrong against his back, and turned toward the tree line without another word, each step away from the mill deepening a suspicion he still couldn't quite name or prove. The flour felt off in his arms the whole walk home, heavier and coarser than it should have been for the price paid, and Thorn's sneer stayed with him longer than any insult aimed at Ragna herself had managed to. He passed the mine entrance on his way out of the village, its timbers dark with age, and noticed how few workers lingered near the surface even at midday, how quickly the ones who did glanced away from any stranger's face. By the time the hut came into view through the trees, Kael had already convinced himself that whatever the village's leaders were hiding ran far deeper than old grudges and simple fear of an orc healer living alone in the woods, and that Ragna's name had been useful to them in ways he was only beginning to understand. Back at the hut, Ragna prepared to bake bread from the flour Kael had carried home, and he knelt beside her at the low table, peeling roots into a wooden bowl, while Leo slept soundly in the next room. Without warning, she froze mid-motion, rubbed a pinch of the pale flour slowly between 2 fingers, lifted it close to her nose, inhaled once, and flung the pinch into the hearth fire without a word of explanation. The flame hissed sharply and flared an unnatural, acrid shade of green that made Kael flinch back from the heat. "Cheap ergot mixed with white clay to bulk out the weight," she said grimly, wiping her fingers clean on her apron, jaw tight. "It rots a person's inside slowly over months, sometimes longer. Cuts the miller's cost on every sack and kills the ones who eat his bread without them ever suspecting why." Kael went very still, the truth landing on him with sickening weight. Thorn was poisoning his own village, sack by sack, purely to save coin on grain. He reached out and pulled the tainted flour from her hands before she could set it anywhere near the boys' food, and their fingers brushed in the exchange, a small, unremarkable touch neither of them mentioned aloud or acknowledged with a glance. Kael felt something settle deep and quiet in his chest, a gratitude sharper than simple relief. Without her nose for poison, without her hesitation at exactly the right moment, he would have fed that same slow rot to his own son, and called it nothing more than bread, and never known why the boy sickened again. He set the ruined sack by the door to be burned later, and for a moment, simply watched her hands work the honest flour that remained, steady and unhurried, as though poisoning a village were an ordinary thing to notice and set aside. Late that night, long after the fire had burned low, a fist pounded hard against the door. A woman stood outside in the cold, half dragging her husband between her arms, a miner whose cough tore up dark blood with every ragged breath he managed. Villagers cursed Ragna openly by daylight and crawled to her door once darkness fell over the trees, and neither she nor Kael spoke aloud of the contradiction sitting plainly between them. They worked together without needing to trade a single word about it. Kael pinning the thrashing man's shoulders flat against the cot, while Ragna forced bitter tinctures past his lips, one careful spoonful at a time. Her hand steady, even as his body convulsed hard against them both. Toward dawn, as Kael washed the blood from his own hands in a basin of cooling water, he noticed a faint yellowish dust clinging stubbornly to the miner's shirt collar and cuffs. He rubbed a pinch of it between his fingers, studying it closely in the dim firelight, with the focus of a man who had spent years pricing raw goods. "I traded with miners up north for years before all this," he said slowly, turning the dust over in his palm. "I've seen dust like this before, more than once. It's an arsenic vein, unless I've forgotten everything I ever learned. If the mine owner is sending men down into shafts like that with no ventilation at all, that isn't an accident waiting to happen. It's a slow execution, spread out over months, so no one notices the pattern." Ragna looked up at him then, something shifting behind her steady golden eyes. A flicker of genuine respect she hadn't offered anyone in a very long time. By midday, Kael walked down to the lower stream to fill buckets for the washing. The water running clear enough at first glance under the pale sky, the current low after days without rain. He crouched at the bank, dipped the pail below the surface, and as he lifted it, something caught his eye along the bottom. A thin, oily residue clinging to the wood, dark and faintly rank. Nothing like the clean mountain water he had drawn from streams 100 times before on the road. He swirled it once more, to be certain his eyes weren't playing tricks on him, tilted the pail toward the light, and watched the film separate slowly across the surface instead of settling. He carried the bucket back to the hut without a word, setting it down hard enough on the table that Ragna looked up from her work. "Smell this," he said, tilting it toward her. "Tell me I'm imagining things, because I'd rather be wrong." Ragna leaned over the pail, wrinkled her nose at the sharpness of it, and shook her head slowly. "You're not imagining anything," she said. "That stream runs down from the old mountain reservoir above the village. Every well down there draws from the same source eventually, mine included, though I've never trusted it fully." Kael set the bucket aside, the pieces already arranging themselves in his mind into something deliberate rather than accidental. "Then whatever's poisoning that water isn't coming from the wells at all," he said. "It's coming from wherever that reservoir sits, higher up than anyone bothers to look. We should climb up and see for ourselves before we guess at anything else." The climb to the reservoir proved longer and harder than either of them expected, the path narrowing into loose stone and switchbacks that forced them to scramble upward, on hands as much as feet, breath coming shorter with every turn. On the steepest stretches, Kael reached back without thinking and offered his hand to steady her over the worst of the rock, a small, unremarkable gesture that Ragna accepted with visible surprise, unused to anyone extending kindness toward her without expecting something in return. Neither of them spoke of it, but she noticed how naturally he kept doing it, again and again, all the way up, never once making a show of the help he offered. At the top, the path leveled into a stone basin ringed by old retaining walls, and what they found there stopped them both cold. The old reservoir sat choked with rotting dead wood, thick silt, and the bloated carcasses of animals that had fallen in and never been cleared. The water beneath it black and stagnant with decay, a smell rising off it that made Kael's stomach turn. Ragna crouched at the edge, running her fingers through the scum without flinching, cataloging what she saw with the same focus she gave any patient. Kael stared at the wreckage for a long moment, memory sharpening into certainty. "I heard men in the market complaining about coin set aside for cleaning this exact reservoir," he said quietly. "Money that never seemed to buy anything, year after year." Ragna's expression hardened as the truth settled over her, gold eyes narrowing on the rot below. "Aldous," she said. "He pocketed it, and let the water rot, and let everyone believe I was the one killing them instead of his own greed." On the way back down, a sudden freezing rain broke over the mountainside without warning, turning the loose stone treacherous underfoot and forcing them both to scramble for shelter beneath the roots of a massive fallen tree, where a narrow hollow offered barely enough room for two bodies pressed close together against the cold. Kael pulled his cloak from his shoulders and settled it over Ragna, despite her protest, the wet wool doing little against the chill, but the gesture mattering more than the warmth itself. She let him do it, which surprised them both more than the rain did. For a long while they sat in silence, listening to the rain hammer the roots above them, their shoulders touching in the cramped space. And then Kael began speaking without quite meaning to, his voice low and unguarded, in a way it hadn't been since the market. "I know poisons and guild schemes better than most traders, because I used to live in the capital," he said. "I had a wife there. She died because officials took bribes instead of doing their duty. And there was nothing I could do to stop it happening right in front of me. I took Leo and left everything else behind me that night." Ragna said nothing for a long moment, watching the rain instead of his face, giving him the privacy of not being looked at while he spoke through it, understanding without needing to be told that some words come easier to a stranger's silence than to a friend's questions. When she finally turned toward him, something in her golden eyes had softened into a quiet, wordless understanding neither of them tried to put a name to, and she let her shoulder rest a little heavier against his, an answer offered without a single word to match his own. Outside, the rain kept falling long after either of them had anything left to say, and neither moved to shift away from the other. To prove the miller's guilt, they needed documents, not suspicion, and the chance arrived sooner than expected when one of Thorne's prize-breeding horses fell suddenly and seriously ill, thrashing in its stall with a fever that spread panic through his whole household. Grinding his teeth against his own pride, the miller sent word for Ragna, the only healer within reach, who might save an animal worth more to him than any villager. Kael went along beside her, posing as nothing more than a porter, carrying her satchel of herbs, keeping his eyes down as they passed through the gate. In the yard, Ragna took immediate command of the situation, barking orders at Thorne and his workers with a sharpness that left no room for argument, sending men running for boiling water and forcing others to hold the animal steady by its halter while she worked over its trembling flank. While every eye in the yard stayed fixed on the horse and the orc healer commanding them all, Kael slipped quietly into the adjoining storehouse unnoticed, his heart hammering despite his steady hands. He moved fast among stacked ledgers and crates, fingers flipping through paper until he found what he needed. Guild invoices detailing a purchase of the same poisonous white clay Ragna had burned in the hearth weeks before. The miller's own signature scrawled at the bottom. He folded the papers small, pressed them flat against his ribs beneath his shirt, and slipped back out into the yard, just as Ragna finished binding the horse's leg, no one the wiser for what had just left the storehouse. Thorne barely glanced his way as they left, too busy fussing over the recovering animal to notice the porter's satchel sitting heavier than it had on the way in, and Kael kept his pace unhurried all the way to the gate, refusing to let relief show on his face until the mill was well behind them. That evening, Kael and Ragna walked into the village tavern to sell what healing salves they could, the low room loud with drink and half its occupants throwing open hostility toward the orc at his side, while she kept her eyes forward and said nothing. In the corner, the mine owner Vane sat hunched over an ale, already well into his cups, his coin purse loose on the table beside him. Kael dropped into the seat across from him uninvited, adopting the easy, cynical air of a ruthless ore buyer scouting a bad deal, and let a slow grin spread across his face as he waved down another round. "Word around here is you've gone soft," Kael said, leaning back in his chair. "Spending good coin shoring up shafts and buying air for men who'd work just as hard scared half to death. That's not running a mine, friend. That's running a charity for miners who don't deserve the coddling." Vane's face reddened, pride flaring under the insult exactly as Kael had hoped it would. "Soft?" the miner spat, slamming his cup down. "I run that mine tighter than any fool before me ever managed. You want to see soft? Go ask the last owner how much he wasted keeping lazy men comfortable and breathing easy." Kael only shrugged, sipping his own drink, letting the silence between them do the provoking, watching Vane's grip tighten around his cup as the man searched for some way to prove him wrong. "Careful," Kael added, almost lazily, turning his cup in slow circles on the table. "A man starts believing his own workers are worth protecting. Next thing he's broke, and everyone else is laughing at him behind his back." The barb landed exactly as intended, and Vane's eyes narrowed with the stubborn fury of a man who cannot let an insult stand unanswered, especially from a stranger who hadn't earned the right to judge him. Stung by the insult, Vane slapped an engineering plan of the mine flat onto the ale-soaked table, jabbing a thick finger at the paper with drunken pride, eager to prove the merchant wrong once and for all. "Look here," he said, tracing a line of sealed shafts with his fingertip. "Bricked those ventilation stalls up myself. Saved hundreds of gold I'd otherwise be wasting on air for lazy workers who ought to be grateful for the wage at all, let alone clean breathing." Kael studied the plan closely, committing every marked shaft to memory while nodding along, as though genuinely impressed by the man's cunning. And when Vane turned to bark at the barmaid for another round, Kael's hand closed briefly over one of the loose cost estimates and folded it away into his sleeve without a sound. Rising from the table a moment later, Kael crossed the room in full view of every hostile stare still fixed on Ragna, pulled out the bench beside her without hesitation, and ordered her a plate of food from the startled barmaid, dropping coin on the counter before she could refuse. He spoke to Ragna plainly and with open respect, ignoring the muttering that rippled through the room around them like a stone dropped in still water. Ragna kept her eyes fixed on her plate, but something in her chest tightened at the sight of him choosing, publicly and without a trace of shame, to sit beside her in front of everyone who despised her. No one in that room had ever done such a thing before, not once, not even the few who had quietly used her medicine in secret and pretended otherwise by daylight, and the weight of it sat strange and warm in her chest long after the meal was finished. The next morning, Kael was splitting wood outside the hut when a group of grim, heavily armed men stepped out from the tree line, their movements deliberate and unhurried in a way that made the threat plain without a single weapon being raised. 6 of them, maybe 7, boots crunching over frost, faces he half recognized from the mill and the mine. They didn't attack. Instead, their leader planted his boots wide and jerked his chin toward the wagon parked beside the hut. "Pack up your brat and get out of these woods while you're still whole," he said, voice flat and unhurried. "Nobody's asking twice, traitor, and nobody's coming to save you out here." Kael's grip tightened on the axe handle, calculating the distance between himself and the nearest man, weighing odds he didn't like. When the hut door opened behind him and Ragna stepped out onto the porch, a heavy woodcutter's axe resting easily in one hand, as though she'd carried it her whole life, her golden eyes fixed on the leader with a stillness far more unsettling than any shout would have been, and she didn't say a single word. The men shifted uneasily under that gaze, their bravado thinning visibly, boots shuffling backward before their leader could stop them. After a long, tense silence, their leader spat once at the ground and stepped back. Tomorrow the talk changes, he said, retreating toward the trees with the others close behind him. The threat left hanging unfinished in the cold morning air. Kael lowered the axe only once the last of them had vanished past the tree line, his heart still hammering, and glanced sideways at Ragna, who had already turned back toward the door, as though nothing more remarkable than a passing storm had just happened on her porch. Kael did not leave. Days later, having failed to frighten them off with threats, the headman Aldous summoned the trader formally to his manor to pay a so-called tax on housing outsiders in the forest, a fee invented on the spot and enforced by nothing but his own authority. Ragna walked with him rather than let him face the man alone, ignoring the servants who flinched visibly at the sight of her crossing the threshold. Aldous' house struck them both as absurdly lavish for a village drowning in sickness and rotten water, polished floors and imported rugs sitting strangely against everything Kael had seen in the poorer streets below, where children coughed blood into their sleeves. Left waiting alone in the receiving room, while Aldous kept them idle on purpose to remind them of his power, Kael let his eyes drift over the furnished space and caught sight of a sealed letter resting on the writing desk, its wax stamped with a lord's crest he recognized from his years trading in the capital. He crossed the room quickly, broke the seal with careful fingers, and skimmed the contents. A lord's letter thanking Aldous for the thorough cleaning of the village wells, confirming receipt of an expense report that accounted for coin never actually spent on the reservoir at all. Footsteps sounded in the hall a heartbeat later, and Kael folded the letter small, jammed it down into his boot, and straightened his coat just as the door swung open, and Aldous stepped through, smiling like a man who owned everything in the room. "Apologies for the wait," the headman said, settling behind his desk as if he hadn't just left them idle on purpose. "Trade with strangers requires proper paperwork." Kael returned the smile just as evenly, betraying nothing of what now sat pressed against his ankle, and reached for his coin purse as though he had nothing else on his mind at all. After the cold exchange and the tax paid, Kael and Ragna left the manor behind them, stepping out into a courtyard where an icy wind had risen while they were kept waiting inside, cutting sharp through cloth and skin alike. Kael pulled the scarf from his own neck without a word and settled it around Ragna's shoulders, his hand steady even as the wind tugged at both of them. She let him, the way she had let him do so many small things by now, and their eyes met for a moment, longer than either of them meant to allow, something unspoken passing between them that neither felt any need to name aloud. Between them, tucked away safe in folded paper and cloth, they now carried proof enough to bury 3 men: the miller's poisoned invoices, the mine owner's sealed shafts, the headman's stolen coin laid bare in a lord's own letter. Kael could still feel the letter's edge digging into his ankle beneath his boot, a constant reminder of how close they had come to being caught. They were no longer just a healer hiding in the woods and a merchant fleeing his own grief, each carrying separate wounds no one else had bothered to notice. Standing there in that cold courtyard, scarf and cloak pressed close together against the wind, they understood without saying it that they had become something else entirely. A united front, armed with truth, ready at last to set things right in a village that had tried to burn them both for less than what they now held in their hands. Neither of them moved to break apart just yet, the wind cutting past them both as if it too had decided to wait. Somewhere down the road, a chained dog barked at nothing, and the ordinary sound of it felt strange against everything they now carried, as though the world hadn't yet caught up to how much had just changed inside that cold manor. Kael decided the local authorities were bought through and through, every one of them rotten in the same coin, and so at first light he set out for the postal station on the neighboring trade road, determined to send copies of every document straight to the lord who governed these lands, bypassing Aldous and his allies, entirely before they could learn what had been stolen from Thorn's storehouse and Vane's own drunken table. Leo, recovering steadily, but still too weak for the journey, stayed behind in the hut under Ragna's watchful protection, propped up on cushions near the fire, with strict instructions not to wander far from the door, even for a moment. "Keep him inside," Kael told her before he left, checking the satchel of documents one last time against his chest, fingers lingering on the strap longer than necessary. "I'll be back before dark, or close to it, and we'll send the second copy after, if the first doesn't reach him fast enough." Ragna only nodded, already turning back toward the boy with a bowl of broth in hand, unbothered by the responsibility settling onto her shoulders, as though she had carried it 100 times before. Kael took one last look at the hut, at the boy propped against the pillows, at Ragna's steady presence beside him, and then turned and vanished into the thick tree line, convinced that his plan would work quietly, without fuss, without any need for bloodshed on either side of this ugly business. He didn't look back a second time, telling himself there was no reason to, that a few hours on the road changed nothing that mattered, though something in his chest tightened anyway, as the hut disappeared behind the first bend in the path. Ragna busied herself around the hut through the morning, grinding herbs into paste at the table, while Leo dozed by the fire, the quiet broken only by the soft scrape of her pestle against stone and the occasional pop of the fire settling. Then, without warning, a distant sound cut through the stillness. The harsh, urgent clang of an alarm bell ringing out from the direction of the village, over and over, too fast and too frantic to mean anything but trouble breaking loose somewhere close. Birds burst upward from the trees outside in a sudden, scattered panic, wings beating loud against the silence that followed the bell's echo, and Leo stirred at the noise, blinking awake against the cushions. Ragna set down her pestle and moved to the window, straining to hear past the wind, her whole body going still in the way it only did when she sensed real danger nearby. Slowly, a low murmur began building through the trees, growing louder with every passing minute, the rumble of many voices raised together, the clatter of metal tools against metal, and beneath it all, a flickering orange glow of torchlight visible now between the distant trunks. The sound didn't scatter or wander the way idle gossip might have. It moved with purpose, a single furious current of footsteps and shouting, pressing steadily closer, cutting straight through the forest toward the clearing where the orc healer's hut stood waiting, undefended, with a sick child inside it and its protector alone. Ragna's hands stilled completely over the herbs, every instinct she had honed over months of quiet vigilance sharpening at once into something closer to dread than caution. The moment the mob broke into view through the trees, pitchforks and torches raised, faces twisted with a fury too coordinated to be spontaneous, Ragna understood exactly why they had come. She didn't waste a second on disbelief. She scooped Leo up from his cushions, pulled back the loose floorboard she had shown him only once before, and lowered him into the narrow root cellar beneath the hut, pressing a finger to her lips. "Whatever you hear," she whispered, "you do not make a sound. Not one, no matter what." She sealed the boards back over him and grabbed her axe from beside the door, stepping out onto the porch to face the crowd head-on, shouting for them to stop, to think, to listen to reason before doing something they couldn't undo, her voice carrying farther than she expected across the clearing. But there were too many of them, and their anger had already burned past the point where words could reach it. Faces set and blank in a way that told her nothing she said would land. She fought as long as she could, swinging the axe in wide, desperate arcs, driving back the first men who came within reach. But there were too many of them pressing forward from every side. Faces she half recognized from market days, now twisted into something she barely knew. and a blow from behind finally dropped her hard onto the packed earth before she could turn to meet it. Rough hands were on her a moment later, binding her wrists with coarse rope, while someone kicked the axe well out of reach, and they dragged her stumbling body back down the forest path toward the village square, her boots scraping useless furrows through the mud the whole way, the hut and the boy hidden inside it, growing smaller behind her with every step. They bound Ragna to the whipping post in the market square, piling dry kindling and brush around her feet, while the crowd pressed in close on every side, shouting and shoving for a better view of the burning to come. Some faces twisted with genuine hatred, and others merely swept along by the noise of it. Aldous stepped forward through the noise, unhurried, a small, satisfied smile fixed on his face as he approached the post, savoring the moment before it happened. He leaned close to her ear, low enough that no one else in the roaring crowd could catch the words meant only for her, his breath sour with wine and satisfaction. "Did you think we didn't notice your little friend sniffing through our homes and papers?" he hissed. "You'll burn today, witch. And once you're ash, we'll find that pup of his and drown him in the same river that took the last of your kind." He straightened, adjusting his coat as though he had merely commented on the weather, and stepped back to let the executioner finish what he had started. Ragna strained hard against the rope, a low growl tearing loose from her throat, more fury than fear, her golden eyes fixed on the executioner as he stepped forward with a lit torch, the flame already licking hungrily at the dry wood stacked around her feet, the heat beginning to rise against her legs before he had even lowered it fully. Somewhere behind her in the crowd, a child was crying, and she thought absurdly of Leo hidden safe beneath the floorboards, hoping he had the sense to stay silent, no matter how long the shouting went on above him, no matter what he might hear happen to her in the next few minutes. The executioner's torch hissed as it swung in a slow, deadly arc, the heat already radiating against Ragna's bound legs. The frenzied chanting of the village mob reached a fever pitch, drowning out the crackle of the dry kindling at her feet. She closed her golden eyes, bracing for the agony, but the silence she expected was suddenly shattered. The rhythmic, thunderous pounding of heavy hooves tore through the village square. A massive black stallion breached the crowd, scattering terrified peasants like dry leaves. Before the horse even came to a full halt, Kael vaulted from the saddle. His boots hit the cobblestones with a heavy thud, and he sprinted straight through the ring of armed guards, throwing himself between the massive orc woman and the executioner's flames. In his raised right hand, he clutched a thick, worn leather folder tightly bound with twine. His chest heaved as he faced the bloodthirsty mob, his dark eyes burning with a terrifying, unyielding resolve. "Halt!" Kael's voice boomed across the square, sharp and authoritative, cutting through the hysteria like a steel blade. "Put out that torch right now. You want the monsters who have been slaughtering your children? You want the witches who poisoned your homes? I have their names right here." He slammed his hand against the leather folder, holding it high for all to see. "Stop this madness, and I will show you the real killers standing right beside you." The sheer force of his command, combined with the desperate certainty in his eyes, sent a shockwave of hesitation through the crowd. The chanting died in their throats. The executioner faltered, lowering his torch. The square descended into a heavy, breathless silence, every eye fixed on the lone merchant who dared to defy their wrath. Taking advantage of the stunned silence, Kael tore the leather folder open. He pulled out a stack of stamped Merchant Guild ledgers and marched straight toward Miller Torn. With a swift, disgusted motion, he flung the heavy parchment directly into the pale man's face. The papers scattered across the cobblestones. "Read them," Kael demanded, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Look at the official manifests. Your trusted miller hasn't bought pure wheat in months. He's been cutting your daily flour with cheap, toxic white clay and ergot mold to line his own pockets." Kael pointed a sharp finger at the local bakers standing in the front row, whose arms were wrapped in bandages. "Look at the green sores on your hands. You thought it was a curse? It's the rot he sold you." Torn stammered, backing away. But Kael was already turning to the soot-stained miners. He unfurled a wide, ink-drawn architectural map, holding it up by the edges. "And you, brothers of the deep, look at Vane's engineering plans for the lower shafts." Kael stepped closer to the hardened workers, tracing his finger along the drawn tunnels. He deliberately ordered the ventilation shaft sealed with stone. He trapped the arsenic dust inside to save a few gold coins on timber, knowing it would burn your lungs to ash. The miners stared at the official seals on the parchment. A terrifying shift rippled through the crowd. The blind, superstitious fear that had driven them to burn an innocent healer melted away, replaced instantly by the cold, heavy realization of betrayal. The mob turned their heads slowly, their eyes locking onto the trembling officials. The air grew thick with a pure, murderous rage. The pitchforks and torches that had been meant for Ragna were now gripped tighter and aimed at the men who had traded their families' lives for gold. Before the corrupt trio could attempt to flee, Kael reached into his boot and pulled out a crisp, folded parchment bearing the heavy wax seal of the regional lord. He held it up directly in front of Aldous. "And finally, the architect of your misery," Kael announced coldly. "An official letter thanking your noble headman for successfully purifying the upper mountain reservoir." He pocketed the lord's silver while letting the rotting animal carcasses poison the drinking water of the lower village. He built his lavish mansion on the graves of your families. Aldous' face turned the color of chalk. Panic stripped away his arrogant facade. "Lies! He's working with the green-skinned beast!" the headman shrieked, his voice cracking with desperation. "Kill them! Kill the merchant and burn the witch!" The few remaining hired guards drew their steel blades, stepping hesitantly toward Kael, but they never even got the chance to swing. With a deafening roar of absolute fury, the peasants surged forward as one unstoppable wave. Miners, bakers, and grieving mothers threw themselves at the guards, easily overwhelming them with sheer numbers. They dragged Aldous, Torn, and Vane into the mud, beating them down and binding them with the very ropes they had brought for the execution. Amidst the chaotic roar of the uprising, Kael ignored the violence entirely. He dropped his dagger and rushed to the wooden post, his hands moving frantically to slice through the thick, coarse knots binding Ragna's wrists. As the heavy ropes fell away, she stumbled forward, her immense strength finally failing her. Kael caught her instantly, pulling her tall, battered frame tightly against his chest, shielding her from the madness of the square. A few days passed, and the heavy atmosphere of death and suspicion that had choked the village finally began to lift. The muddy roads trembled beneath the disciplined march of heavily armored war horses as a formidable detachment of the royal guard rode into the settlement. Kael's desperate missive to the regional lord had reached its destination, and the crown's justice was swift and unforgiving. The villagers gathered along the main street, their faces hard and unyielding as they watched the spectacle unfold. Aldous, Torn, and Vane, stripped of their fine silks and velvet coats, stumbled through the dirt in heavy iron shackles. They were shoved roughly into the back of barred prison wagons, looking small and pathetic. The crowd did not hold back, hurling rotten vegetables, clods of dirt, and vicious curses at the men who had orchestrated their suffering. The imposing commander of the royal guard rode to the center of the square, his polished silver armor gleaming in the afternoon sun. He unrolled a long parchment and cleared his throat. "By order of his lordship, these men are charged with high treason, mass murder, and embezzlement," the commander declared, his voice carrying over the angry mutters. Furthermore, every asset, coin, and piece of land belonging to the condemned is hereby seized. It shall be completely liquidated and distributed among the families affected by this vile conspiracy. A collective sigh of relief washed over the crowd. While gold could never bring back the dead, the promise of true restitution and the sight of the corrupt officials being hauled away to the gallows brought a long-awaited sense of closure to the wounded community. With the rot excised from its core, the village underwent a rapid and miraculous transformation. For the first time in a year, the people worked together not out of fear, but out of genuine hope. Strong groups of men hiked up the mountain trails to dredge the ruined reservoir, tearing out the decaying debris until fresh, crystal-clear water finally flowed back into the lower wells. Down in the valley, women hauled heavy sacks of the tainted, clay-laced flour from the mill into the square, tossing them into a massive bonfire that burned away the last remnants of the miller's greed. The most profound change, however, occurred at the edge of the dark woods. A long, quiet line of villagers formed outside Ragna's modest hut. They did not come with torches or accusations. Instead, they carried baskets of fresh venison, woven fabrics, and warm loaves of bread. One by one, they stepped forward, offering sincere, tear-filled apologies to the imposing orc woman who had tirelessly fought to save them while they had wished her dead. Standing on her porch, Ragna accepted their offerings with slow, dignified nods, feeling the ancient, hardened shell around her heart finally begin to soften and crack. The heavy burden of her lifelong isolation was washing away. Out in the grassy yard, the sound of bright, untroubled laughter filled the air. Leo, fully recovered from the deadly fever, and with roses back in his cheeks, was gleefully running in circles, playing a boisterous game of tag with the local children who had once been forbidden to go near the witch's domain. Ragna watched the boy with a soft warmth in her golden eyes, realizing that this land was no longer hostile territory. It was finally a place where life could thrive. A warm, golden evening gently settled over the forest, painting the sky in deep shades of violet and amber. The village was quiet, resting after days of exhausting labor. Kael and Ragna sat side by side on the sturdy wooden steps of her porch, listening to the soothing chorus of crickets in the tall grass. The scent of pine and crushed herbs lingered in the air between them. Kael leaned back, letting out a long, contented breath as he watched the fireflies dance near the tree line. Without a word, he reached across the space between them and gently took Ragna's large, rough hand in his own. Her long green fingers twitched in surprise, but she did not pull away, instead letting him trace the calluses on her palm with his thumb. "I have spent years moving from town to town, constantly looking over my shoulder," Kael said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought the road was the only place we could be safe, but I am so incredibly tired of running." He turned his head to look up into her striking face, his dark eyes filled with absolute certainty. "I don't want to travel anymore, Ragna. I found my true home right here." Ragna's breath hitched. For her entire life, she had been a terrifying outcast, an unwanted beast. Yet, looking at the man who had risked the flames to save her, she felt nothing but cherished. A beautiful, vulnerable smile graced her lips, revealing the tips of her sharp tusks. She leaned down, closing the distance between them, and their lips finally met in a deep, passionate kiss. A slow, burning promise of a future built on unbreakable trust. The kiss was unhurried and profound, sweeping away the last remnants of their painful pasts and sealing the bond they had forged in the fires of survival. The crisp, cool morning air was broken by the sharp trottle of a single horse, making its way up the dirt path to the cabin. A courier wearing the royal blue and silver colors of the regional lord dismounted and approached the porch, handing a heavy, wax-sealed scroll directly to Kael before turning his horse back toward the capital. Kael broke the wax and unfurled the thick parchment. His eyes quickly scanned the elegant, sweeping calligraphy. The lord of the territory had written personally, acknowledging that the village, situated on a vital and lucrative trade route, had suffered long enough under the corrupt administration. Because of your undeniable integrity, your sharp intellect, and your proven courage in exposing this treason, Kael read aloud, his voice thick with disbelief. I hereby appoint you as the new permanent headman of the settlement, effective immediately. He slowly lowered the scroll, staring out at the vibrant green canopy of the forest, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in his destiny. He turned his gaze to Ragna, who stepped close to him. She did not say a word, but her golden eyes shone with immense pride as she reached out and gave his shoulder a firm, encouraging squeeze. Just then, Leo burst out the front door, his wooden toy sword in hand, wrapping his arms tightly around Ragna's waist in a joyous morning hug. The wandering merchant who had stopped running, the exiled orc healer who had finally found her people, and the young boy who had brought them together stood on the porch in the morning sun, ready to build their new life as a true, inseparable family. They had faced the darkest depths of human greed and survived it side by side. Now, with the village looking to them for guidance and the shadows of their pasts fully banished, their slow and painful journey had finally blossomed into a bright, enduring dawn. If this story resonated with you, please hit like and subscribe to Orcs Tales. Please also write in the comments what you liked most about the story and what you didn't. Which parts were the most interesting to you, and which ones you found boring. I will take your feedback into account and strive to make future stories even better. I'll be waiting for you here when you're ready for the next story.